trees are probably 24 to 36 inches, somewhere in there. And so what you want to do, how far do you want me to take this? These are in potted trees.
Oh, these are potted.
Yeah, we can't get pear fruit yet. Well, we can. There's someone that's producing it. But anyway, so basically you want to go, if you come closer. Or
wait, so start at the beginning. Did you use an auger?
These here, no, we just hand plant. We basically just a shovel. Yeah. And then with the shovel, planted the tree. It came in a pot. Came with this particular stick here to keep them straight as they're growing in the pot. And we just had an auger with a generator, electric drill, drilled down, put this in with a hammer, and tied the tree to it. And much farther you want to go?
No, that's, well, I would just like you to talk about how you pruned so far.
Well, how we pruned, basically, first year we left the tree. The next year, basically we've stripped buds down this way. So all you did was you took a glove and stripped the buds down, and then we picked out our laterals. This one here, we're still in that process. So we want to pick out laterals here, and probably anywhere from 3 to 5 is what you want left as the main tree.
In between there, you topped it.
I topped it, yes, and that's what I was going to show there a minute ago. You can see where our initial topping was. It's right here. Yeah. So.
Is that 36, Don?
That was actually at about 36. This one. Yeah. But the Yamhill, you want to go a little higher.
Yeah.
So yeah, we saw some Yamhill trees down in Oregon that were probably 13 years old that belonged to, what's their names again? Berkmeyer, yes. And he actually, when he started he's got scaffolding coming out here, and it's just difficult. I mean, he's having a heck of a time harvesting, because of that. So,
yeah, a lot of Yamhill growers are using sickle bar to hedge underneath.
Right.
To maintain that access.
But I think probably, I know Helmut here, we had him come out, and with the Yamhill, he said that we should maybe top them at 40 inches.
Yes.
Okay, or 42 or whatever, just to get that, the growth coming that way. So,
I agree with that.
Yeah.
I mean, so if we back up a little bit, because like orchard establishment is so critical. You have to get your trees off to a good start, or you can just have problems upon problems. When you are planting potted trees, guys are sometimes using an auger to make a hole, and you want to make sure that you're not creating sort of a pot that's going to restrict the roots. That's very common, especially on heavier soils. So if you're planting too wet, a lot of times the tree never gets out of the planting hole itself. And this is not a critique, but we always protect the trunks either with paint or with trunk guards. And a lot of the herbicide labels now for sucker management, they want you to use a trunk guard because it's a liability for them. So they're starting to put that on labels now that they want a trunk guard in place.
Just initially, though.
Yes, initially. Yeah. And but the trunk guards cause a lot of problems as well. So it's a thing of scale. So if you have to spray a lot of suckers, you might consider trunk guards because you can do it without paying as much attention, essentially.
Yeah, but what we found was that we basically hand pruned all our suckers for the first 3 years, ask Joe here. Yeah, and after that, once the bark was hard enough where you could take your nail and scrape it without scraping the bark off, then we went to ignite, and there's not a problem. So,
what's considered initially? Like, how long would you have a trunk guard on for? 1 year,
1 to 2 seasons. But one of the problems they cause that's extremely common problem that I deal with all the time is, depending on what type of trunk guard you use, their manufacturers are marketing all kinds of trunk guards to you guys. Some of them are going to be paper, some of them are totally opaque, and others are translucent. So the theory is if it's letting some light in, hopefully that bark is hardening off a little bit. But it's too common to take off the trunk guard and then the tree just gets sunburned immediately because you have a comment.
Mike, what do you
avoid black color because we have sometimes you see the sun scorch there one side. I have seen that some of the trees are one side is exposed, there's probably some cracking there.
Yes, and that is a big problem because it creates an avenue for pathogens to enter the trunk. And so that's why we paint. And we usually, depending on how high up you're heading off your tree, so we're talking about doing it a little higher on Yam Hill. Does that leave more of the bark exposed? It potentially does. So you have to be concerned about the parts of the bark that are getting direct sun. And any management that you do, any pruning that is going to expose more of the bark to the sun could lead to sunburn. So that's always should be a consideration. Even mature trees, when we go in and we do heavy pruning, like say dehorning or even temporary tree removal sometimes, can create new exposure for the bark, and it can be burned. Even a mature tree can be burned, and that's really where like we get the turkey tails and the wood rot fungi come in and move in on those sunburns, and that can kill your tree ultimately. So I like paint. I know you guys are farther north than we are, but I think it's still probably a concern here. We just use white latex paint. You can water it down if you want to, or you can just use it straight, but make sure it's just white latex. Definitely don't get like the bathroom paint that has stuff mixed in to kill mold. So I agree with what Don's done here really well, and first of all, I should back up and just say that we don't have long-term experience with any of these new varieties. So Helmut's Orchard down the road, that's as old as any Jefferson that we have in Oregon, essentially. I mean, 10 to 12 years old, that's going to be the oldest orchard you're going to find anywhere of Jefferson. So we don't have long-term experience, and so I tend to lean a lot on the nut industries in California and their trajectory that they've been on for pruning, and they've gone back and forth a lot on almonds and walnuts on how much they should be pruned. And it started out with a lot of pruning, and then now they've sort of concluded after these 30-year studies that pruning doesn't really pay, right? Annual pruning doesn't really pay in those nut crops. Once you establish the structure of the tree, then after that you may only need interventions occasionally, and that's, you know, like in Yam Hill, we're talking about the low branches that interfere with the ability to manage the orchard, but other hanging branches that hit you on the head when you're driving through with your tractor, that kind of stuff needs to be taken care of. But as far as annual pruning, we have studies initiated, but it's going to take years to figure this out. But I really have a feeling that pruning too much can be problematic. You're going to be taking out fruiting wood at some point. So I think the best thing to do is to get it all taken care of in the first few years and get your tree structure set up, and then you can do some minor pruning after that. But really, once the tree is set up, it should be good for the long term.
Here's a example of the trunk.
Okay.
Tie that down.
Yeah. So there's a manufacturer that they're a little thicker than this, and I've been to an orchard where he ran out of the corrugated black and white, and he put those on and he killed every tree with it because they get too hot on the inside, and that one's not ventilated at all. So you got to watch out for the clear ones, and it's not a bad idea to add extra ventilation if you don't feel that there's airflow around that trunk. So Steve and I were talking, another mistake with the trunk art, especially the wrap style, is just to crank this thing on really tight, and then they'll throw mulch over the top of that. That holds the moisture along the trunk, and it makes really nice conditions for pathogens. And we see bacterial blight and cankers will form underneath those wraps. So I think good airflow around the trunk is really important.
How often would you paint that trunk then? If you painted initially on year one,
No, usually the one painting is good, but growers that have been burned, so to speak,
Yeah.
you'll see them reapply every couple years
Every
because
couple
they
years.
don't want to take the risk. Because
Yeah.
once it happens, it can really devastate.
Especially southern exposure. You take the south side of the tree, it's going to get way more UV exposure than the north side.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I really like how Don's been keeping up with stripping his buds, especially early on. What you don't want is large caliper wood forming on your trunk. Even this one is a little bit concerning. So one thing you'll notice about Jefferson, it really likes acute growth angles. So look at this branch as an example. It's really coming off this scaffold at a pretty steep angle. It's not a good angle. It's not strong. And those will form as water sprouts on the main trunk. Now, when you have a branch coming off at a really steep angle, it's almost impossible to cut that out without making a big wound on that trunk. And what I'm here to warn you about is, basically, I don't get to see very many beautiful orchards. I get to see the ones that have the problems. And we have a lot of trunk problems. And a lot of it stems from these pruning wounds on the trunk. Sunburn, as we've discussed, is another one. But you don't want to let these branches get up to a big caliper on your main trunk, because, as I mentioned, when you go in to remove that, you're going to make a big wound, and that provides a place for invasion for pathogens.
What would you do with that one there?
This one isn't. I'm not as concerned because it's up in the tree. Although I will tell you that Jefferson has a problem with this, and there's a couple things that happen. Bark inclusion. When you get that really steep angle, as the branches grow, the bark becomes included in the growth, and that's extremely weak, and that's another place for pathogens to invade. We had a freak snowstorm in Oregon this spring, and it was pretty devastating to Jeffersons about this age and a little bit older, because when you get a lot of weight on these branches like that, they just break off. So that's what happened. We had a lot of Jefferson that were just split and laying out like this. And there's a central trunk in the middle, but the tree's laying on the ground, 360 around it. So it pays to pay attention to those trunk angles, I think. So otherwise, I'd say this tree's in really good shape. After you head the tree, you really want to sort of select scaffolds that are growing in different directions so that you're occupying as much of the space around the tree as possible, making the most of sunlight interception. If you're not getting the sun, you're not going to get nuts. So anything you can do to increase the exposure of the scaffold branches to the sun can be beneficial. So a lot of growers on Jefferson will come back into the tree and thin out the middle a little bit. It's a very grower-friendly tree. You get the wine glass shape, and as it matures and the tree starts to produce, it'll start to fill out a little bit and start to lay over more over time. But overall, it's a very friendly tree. Has a very good shape.
Which limbs are the scaffold limbs?
The scaffold limbs are just going to be your main limbs. So you want 3 to 5 of them. And so after it's hard to see on this tree because it's got leaves on it, but you essentially, after you head the tree off, so you picture just a thin whip of a tree, where you head it off, you're going to stimulate the growth of the buds just below where you headed it off. And so that's year 1, basically. You won't have to do much more than that, depending on the state of the tree when you receive it. So if generally the nursery is going to give you a tree that's ready to plant out. If not, if you're getting a really young tree in a pot, it's probably good to hold that over for a year until you get enough growth. And it's also okay if your whip takes a little time to get up to the height where you're going to head it off. That's fine. You can let it go. But again, you always want to watch those lower buds on the trunk and take those out. So after you've headed it, you're going to stimulate the growth right out from that heading cut. And when you come back the second year, you should have some branches to choose from. So then you're going to select 3 to 5 of those to be your main scaffolds. So those are the arms of the tree that are going to hold up the nuts. You want, you know, good angles. You want them in to occupy as much of that space as possible.
Okay, I see what you're saying.
So we want to head that tree pretty much as soon as it reaches that height?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Don't let it go beyond and then take a foot off. to
We
get up.
say belt buckle, but obviously we're not all at the same.
When we
so-
started doing that, we're out in February doing it, and it's like, oh, we're standing on a foot of snow. So
Oh yeah.
here.
Yeah. So I think we learned a lot from that snowstorm this year about these angles on the scaffold branches. So I think that's going to be important for you guys up here. You're probably a little more prone to snow. Like I said, for us, it was kind of a freak thing.
Well, we've seen ice storms too that
Yeah.
cause the same thing.
Yeah.
Split
Okay.
the trees right in half. I thought Yamhill was a little more susceptible, was my impression.
We had that ice storm in Mission there at the orchard, and it just decimated probably half of the most mature trees because they're the bigger and they're holding more snow on there,
Yeah.
and they split them wide open.
Yeah, and mature trees will get a lot of moss growth that holds a lot of water too, that makes them even heavier when you get those ice storms.
Yeah.
So
I
you
just noticed on this tree there's one here that's crisscrossing over and touching another branch.
yeah,
Would that be one you would take out?
probably I would, yeah. You don't want your scaffolds competing with each other. You want them to be as independent as they can be.
So you're saying, if I'm hearing you correctly, you're gonna, when you're ready to prune, you're gonna choose 5 scaffold branches,
Yes.
and you're gonna prune the rest out, and you're gonna try and pick ones that aren't at that steep angle. You're gonna try and pick your
Yes.
scaffolds to be a little bit further out.
Yes.
Okay.
And
Exactly.
evenly around.
Yeah.
Right, okay.
So I don't think really much needs to be done with this right now. But you could, if you're worried about these kind of branches, you could come thin these out without causing a lot of concern.
These cut back. How long do you cut back?
The tips,
The scaffolds back, branches.
cut them back.
Yeah.
Okay, well, a lot of people are tipping. So after they get their scaffold set up,
Yep.
they'll come in and tip all their scaffolds
Yep.
to stimulate more forking and growth.
Do
And
you do that once or several years?
probably
or-
once is enough. Probably like around the 3rd year.
Could you open this tree up a bit by taking 1 or 2 main out of the middle to get more light in the middle?
I think you could, but I think
This one looks really balanced.
it's a pretty good tree. I mean, I wouldn't worry too much about it, but it comes down to grower taste. A lot of guys are real hands-on and they really want to, you know, they've got the time and they want to put a lot of time into every tree. You can do that. You know, I guess what I'm telling you, there's not really a wrong way to do it. I'm just saying there are these things that you can look out for that can cause trouble down the road. And I think the branch angles are one of the biggest factors.
What about season of pruning? Is it better to do it dormant?
So great question, season of pruning. We know tree wound response is much better when there's sap flowing. So if you're gonna go in and prune on, hazelnuts are never 100% dormant, they're always doing something right. But I think that pruning during really wet periods is a bad idea. And I also think that pruning at the start of the dormant season could be problematic as well, because the tree is going to sit there with that wound and there's no sap flowing. It can't respond in the same way it would if it's growing, actively growing. So I've sort of, without a lot of data, I think that pruning toward getting closer to bud break can be beneficial.
If he did decide to take that one off, how would you cut that off?
This one?
That one that's kind of growing up.
Yeah, so you'll see why these are hard to do.
He just
I'm
wants
curious
you
how
to
he
cut it.
Yeah.
So
Still go back.
that's a little longer than I like.
Yeah.
So every branch is going to have a collar, and it's a little raised tissue, and you want to take it right back to that collar without leaving a stub. You can see.
You want to leave the collar, right?
You want to leave the collar. I'm sorry. Yeah, if I wasn't clear. Leave the collar. Cut up to the collar. Leave that collar. because that's where the callus tissue forms and it'll come over and cover that wound. So that turned out not to be too bad, but they get steeper and they get harder to cut off.
If that was the case, would you cut higher up and just on an angle, or always want to get back to that collar?
I don't like you to leave that stub because the stub is going to get colonized by fungi and they're going to move the tree potentially.
So the collar is gonna grow over and seal up?
Yes. Okay. Exactly. You'll see that the collar will move in and form over the wound, close it up eventually.
Do you prune your pollinators?
Like here's a good example here. You can see this is the collar. It hasn't come out. It hasn't covered up this whole wound here. I'm not sure why, but at least you can see what the collar looks like on that.
Is there anything you can apply to that when you're pruning it that would help protect it or heal it?
I don't know, Stephen. You could probably speak to that. I know you're applying something. Okay. How do you seal up a wound if you want
Is there
to
a
do
product
that?
you can use to promote?
Usually people just, even if you are painting, I think it takes time to close up the wounds. Plus of the natural injuries, they just form the callus layer and closes up. But the infection I would worry about in the springtime, because most of the infection coming with the moisture. So that's the time I would really pay attention. So if you are just as much as you are pruned, if you are concerned, I would either paint would do, like if you are doing some paint, that you can maybe put some paint, or something copper based. You can do copper based. If you put a copper base on top of it, then that's probably prevent most of the infection.
You've got a button that's just at the back of where you prune.
Yes.
You take that off with your finger or not? Did you leave it?
I would just
Now
leave
you're
it.
just going to get another one.
You are, yes.
Yeah,
But
okay.
hopefully the one that you left is gonna grow
Everything else,
and help
okay.
impede it.
Sure. Okay.
So it's about favoring the branches you want,
Yeah.
and that over time, it will reduce the competition from the
Yeah,
buds.
There's another question about, do you prune your pollinators the same? This one here is the pollinator.
Oh, that's a good question. I have no idea.
Okay, good question. There we go.
I mean, we don't really worry about it. They get treated the same. But like Felix, you guys have Felix, I'm sure. It has a lot of vigor, and they just tend to be more vigorous. I think that's beneficial because you have a bigger tree, you can get the catkins, and you can get more pollen radiating out.
So will you just leave the tree like that then? Just let it go?
I wouldn't worry about it. 'Cause
Yeah.
you're not so concerned about the
Not production.
at all.
Okay.
But everything else goes because you need that tree to stay healthy.
Yeah, exactly.
These farmers that are using their sickle bars to hedge prune their yam field, in a way you could say that's could be problematic with, because you're not cutting it at the collar, it's going where the machine is going.
Yeah, that's any of the mechanized pruning is not pretty either. It creates a lot of wounds and kind of chews up the wood instead of cutting it clean. There's definitely more risk. So we have guys now that hedge on Barcelona and Ennis to keep them producing. They'll hedge one side of all the trees one year, and then they'll come back to the other side, and it stimulates so much growth when they come through and just hit it with the sickle bar or that big rotating hedging things. It creates this amazing flush of growth, which will then produce nuts the following year. But it really permanently alters sort of the growth trajectory of that tree. You just get really thick growth that would be hard to recover from without taking the cuts back down to the trunk.
So Nick, on that tree there then, this is second year, would you be taking off all of these? Like so you're snipping that back. Would you make it all the same height? Or would you just go, because you can see how much higher those are, you know? So what would you suggest?
Yeah, if you're gonna tip, I
Yeah.
would do it all the same height.
So you'd do it all the same height?
Yes.
Okay. And you say if we're gonna tip.
Yes.
If we didn't tip, what would
You'll
happen?
be fine. These
Yeah.
branches will, they're gonna grow fairly upright, but over time they'll start to.
Oh, they will, okay, yeah.
So because I don't have data on that, I think that's a matter of taste. I mean, you know, a lot of girls like to do it.
Right. Okay.
Any other questions? Orchard establishment. So these are dry land?
I mean,
No irrigation.
oh yeah, there's irrigation in the ground. Yeah.
Okay, so
Yeah.
subsurface drip.
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah. Yeah. So all our fields are that way. We did leave some sucker growth over here. If you wanted to show sucker growth.
Sure.
I don't know. People that haven't seen it. Yeah.
Do you have any updates on your irrigation trials?
Well, we're looking at subsurface drip now too. I think subsurface drip is an excellent choice for hazelnuts because if you're doing surface drip, when you come to harvest, it's always you're going to do damage or you're going to roll everything up and put it away. Either way, it's more work. So I think the subsurface drip is a really good fit. What's your spacing here? No, your spacing.
This is 18 minutes.
Oh, okay. But the
So-
emitters are different.
Exactly. So the 36-inch spacing on 9 by 18 orchards are really well.
Yeah.
So you can there's a good wide selection of the emitter spacing on the drip tube that you can choose for subsurface or surface drip. But what we're going to, well, we're looking at all different types of irrigation. Subsurface, as I mentioned, I think is a really good choice for hazelnut growers, just because you have nothing on the surface to interfere with harvest or other activities.
No evaporation.
Yeah, less evaporation from the soil. You probably see wet spots though. That soak up. Yeah.
We do.
Is that can I go to any irrigation place and they have that information, or is this like a specific way of irrigating?
Kevin will put it in for you.
I install it. Southern Drip knows all about it. Water Tech does a little bit of it.
Okay.
Well, he's from Summerland.
Okay.
Me? No, I'm from the island.
Oh, okay,
Yeah,
sorry.
Cowichan Valley.
I have a question.
Yes.
The root system, like surface feeders or
Yeah,
just
but you're on top.
Oh, that's a great question. So hazelnuts are not deep rooted. They'll have some deeper roots for anchorage, but most of the feeder roots are within the upper 2 feet of the soil profile. So they're shallow. So the roots roughly mirror the drip line of the tree. And that's important to keep in mind if you're planting double density orchards. Are people familiar with that concept? Yeah. Yeah. So when you're planting on when you have double density, it's a tough decision to know when you're going to take out your temporary trees. And essentially, you want to do it before they're really competing. And you can sort of manipulate that by hedging back on your temporary trees as they start to come together and start to favor your permanent trees. But I think, have a huge crisis coming in our industry because roughly 80% of the new 40,000 acres of hazelnuts in Oregon are planted on double density. And if you talk to the older guys that have been through it before, most of them will tell you that they would not do double density again. Okay, it's hard. It's a lot of work to take out the trees. And our old, if you look at the Oregon enterprise budget for hazelnut production, there's a section in there on the economics of double density planting, and it shows that you're gonna make your money sooner because obviously you're occupying more of the space, producing twice the nuts early on, and it all pencils out to around year 9 or 10 you're gonna be taking out those temporary trees. Unfortunately, that work is all based on dryland Barcelona. Now that we've got subsurface drip, we're doing a lot more feeding of the trees, a lot of people are fertigating, we're getting a lot more growth out of the trees. And what I'm hearing from a lot of guys is that double density does not pencil out because the trees are coming into competition much sooner than they were in the old dryland Barcelona. So literally at the research station in Aurora, I've got some fourth leaf Jefferson that are just about touching, and they're on double density. So
At 9 feet?
Yep, at 9 feet. Yep.
We found the same thing. We're mainly Yam Hill.
Yeah.
And the 5-year-old trees are virtually touching right now. So we're moving them this fall at 5 years old, and wouldn't double plant again.
Yep.
Don't
See.
recommend it.
Yep. That's. I'm glad you spoke up there because it probably differs a little by the variety as well.
That's what we figured. The
Yamhill really spreads. You're going to get even less time.
Sounded good on paper, but way ahead of schedule. We haven't hardly had any nuts off them, but they're already interfering with each other. So.
Yeah, so I'm sorry that information is still out there. And maybe, well, actually, to be honest, it doesn't matter what we say. Growers are still going to do it.
We're all in the same boat. Everybody starting at the same time. And
yeah, exactly.
Didn't know what to do. So.
And they're all going to learn the hard way. So, and plenty of examples of orchards that were planted double density and trees were never, the temporaries were never removed. The trees will grow like candlesticks. You'll get, it's really upright growth.
Yep.
It's impossible to manage, and it's not as productive.
30 feet high.
You keep referring to them.
Yeah.
You keep referring to them as temporaries. Does anybody actually transplant those temporaries?
Oh, that's a great question. That's been tried many times. One example I'm familiar with is, I think they were about 9-year-old Jeffersons that were transplanted. First mistake is not clocking the tree to the same aspect it was in the orchard. So, you lose your orientation when you're moving the thing with a nursery spade, and the trunks just fry because they're on the they're oriented.
Now south.
North is now south, exactly. The trees just go into this mode where they might survive, but they just stop really growing and producing, and you'd be better off with a replant that's going to pass that tree in a few years.
Nobody's transplanting them, say, at 5.
Even then, it's not. They do transplant trees that age at the breeding program because they have to move trees around sometimes, and you can talk to them about it, but they don't. The trees, it really hurts them bad. It's not worthwhile.
We have a guy going to do ours in fall here with a spade, and I think he's got about 40 inch on the skid steer. So he came and looked at the trees, and his thought was that the trees won't even know they've been moved. They're still.
Now you know to orient them.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
Paint those sides. That's
right.
He should know that, but yeah.
Yeah. So I'll be interested to hear what you say in a couple of years.
Yeah. Well, this will be the first year, so we'll kind of try about 100 trees of the oldest orchard this year, and we'll start filling up the rest of the fields with transplanting trees every year, I think now. So
Focus on your roots.
Just going back to planting where you use a drill for doing the pots.
Sure.
If you score the edges, is that good enough, or?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know that that's been tried, but that probably would help.
Like if you had just a cross or something, like drill the hole and throw a cross into it, it'll break the edges up.
Yeah, I could see how that could have a benefit.
Yeah. How else would you do it if you're not going to do it that way?
Well, just
dig it?
a shovel or also ripping the planting line too.
Okay.
Do that sometimes. I just had something I forgot to say.
It'll come to me.
Yeah. How deep would you rip?
So a lot of guys think they're going to deep rip to break up a clay a layer.
Yeah.
It'll work for a couple years, but then it'll reform.
Yeah.
So I think deep ripping works great for annual crops, but for hazelnuts, I think it's a short-term gain, but there may be some benefit to it.
Oh, I thought you were saying like to deep rip your plant line so it just makes it easier to plant them.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah. A lot of our planting is GPS guided, so they'll use rip lines to mark the tree positions, which can help with the actual planting hole too. Yes.
Back to the double density planting. I know in the past there's some people have tried treating a tight row as a hedge instead of as individual trees.
Yes.
Do you see that as being an option for some of these orchards that have been double density planted?
So the hedge type planting, I was talking to someone earlier about that. We have a lot of experiments going on with that. I know you guys are all familiar with berry harvesting around here. Litauen makes an orchard harvester now that's meant to go over the top of trees. So we have guys trying that. In the Midwest, where they are growing hybrid hazelnuts, so they're Corilla Coryllis americana, Coryllis avellana hybrids. They're even more of a bush, so we didn't talk about suckers yet, but suckers are one of the biggest costs and labor intensive aspects of hazelnut production, because we're trying to fight a tree, we're trying to make a bush into a tree here. Interestingly, the reason, well, you're probably aware a lot of the world does not grow single trunk hazelnut. That got started in Oregon because of bacterial blight, which the infections would, drip down in the wet season onto the trunks, and the infections would be worse than a single trunk. Plus, the harvest is so much easier. You have clearance, and there's a number of reasons, but so we do have reasons for growing them that way. And the hedgerows, I think, are tough. It's tough to get the nuts out of them. I don't see any of these over-the-row harvesters working real well, since we're growing free husk varieties that drop the nuts to the ground. How are you going to come over that with an over-the-top harvester? You're going to get the ones that are ripe, you're going to knock a bunch off. Some of them are going to be unripe. There's a number of problems, I think, with that situation. Also, just maintaining the vigor of the tree to a level where a harvester like that would actually work. It's going to have to include some hedging, I think, because they're big trees, they're vigorous trees if we don't have rootstocks. You just hit me what I was going to say before. We have a big advantage in hazelnuts over other orchard crops because they're on their own roots. So one benefit is that if something happens to your main trunk, you can bring back a sucker and you can reproduce the tree in short time. So we've got a big issue right now on young trees with a borer that gets into the trunk, girdles the tree. The tree's response to that, and really its response to any disease in the trunk, is going to be to increase suckering if it can. And so in many cases, if you've got a problem in your trunk, it's better to cut bait and bring back a tree that's going to have a good structure to it from a sucker. And it's amazing how much of the energy of the tree, the carbohydrates, they're stored in the roots. And so it may, even if a tree's only had a season or two in the field, there's enough energy in there that it will vastly outproduce a replant if you bring back a sucker.
Is there a good time for that? Like, is there a time where there's most of the nutrients into the roots?
Well, certainly after leaf drop. But it's good to sort of start selecting suckers. If you've got a few to choose from, you're going to want one that's not attached to the main trunk at all. It's coming up independently from the root system. And you might save a few until you figure out which one you like the best.
You mentioned fertigation, and we do soil analysis for the main three elements and pH. At what stage in the growth of the tree should we be concerned about the trace elements like boron, magnesium, that sort of thing?
Basically, the micros are important for the nut production, and so
the tree's more mature then?
I wouldn't worry about it so much on the young trees, but when you start to get into bearing, then it becomes pretty important. And we have a standard boron spray that we do for increasing nut set, but it's interesting because it's controversial. They don't do it in Europe. They say it makes no difference. So we also have a lot of, it's hard for me to keep up with. We have so many different ag companies with their hazelnut programs, and they're all in competition for the growers' business. And they're putting on a lot of stuff. We're doing a lot of nutrition studies, and it's fascinating to me to see the nutrient levels in trees in different orchards. And for guys that are minimalists, sometimes having just as good of nutrient levels as the guys that are making a lot of applications.
Do you agree, Rick?
So far, in everything except the micronutrients. I'm sorry, they're critical right out of the gate, because your NPK isn't going to be utilized properly even in day one if your micros are out of line.
I agree with that, but a young tree's got everything it needs. You don't need to be fertilizing the really young trees unless you have an issue in your orchard.
Yep. Yeah, and I want to help them along.
Yes, I understand. And I think that okay. So we got a lot of studies going on. We got irrigation, we got nutrition, and these things are all connected. And we've been watering the heck out of some trees. And what we're seeing there is it doesn't necessarily translate into nut production. And I also talk to growers on a regular basis that are concerned that they're pushing too much growth with these nutrients, particularly too much nitrogen, because there's this philosophy that a little's good, more is better. And we're pushing growth too much, we're making weak trees. And I think that's also a problem. I feel that a lot of the trees that are dry land, they're stronger, healthier trees. That's just what I'm seeing in the field.
Well, I would agree with that. We're pushing way too much for growth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so far, dryland trees have been keeping up with the irrigated trees in terms of nut production. If you look at the actual caliper of the trunk, the amount of annual growth the tree's putting on, there's no comparison. So my question here is, how does this translate to practice? Are we, because a lot of growers are paying a lot for land now, so they want to get the early production if they can. However, I feel that it may be better to grow a big tree first and not worry about the production. In fact, maybe we should even be thinning off the early fruiting like they do in tree fruits to favor the vegetative growth, get that tree up to a good big size where it's going to produce lots of nuts when you want it to. But as far, going back to irrigation for a second, is this a twin, just single line? Okay. So one thing about subsurface is it's going to be a semi-permanent installation, right? So you want it to work for your tree roots over a long period of time. When you're first starting out, you're going to have, a root area about like that on your potted tree. That's not the time to rely on a permanent, semi-permanent subsurface drip line, because typically you're going to have that, out in here, like a foot and a half at least off of that trunk. On either side, it's better to have two lines if you can. So typically what guys are doing is you start with a single drip line with emitters on your trunks, near your trunks, for the first season before you would switch over to using a more permanent twin drip line on either side of the trunk or a twin subsurface line. We're also seeing really good results with full coverage systems, and I like how these guys are maintaining grass cover here on these young trees. That's really beneficial for the soil. We do a lot of bare ground, and if you're going to do, for some reason, a lot of growers feel like their orchard floor has to be prepped for harvest from day one, and that's not the case at all. You can go several years with a cover crop, or now that we're planting wetter soils that get too slick to harvest if we get fall rains early. A lot of guys are going to cover crop by necessity now, and it depends a lot on the type of harvester that's used to pick up the nuts. Some of the newer harvesters are much better at picking up over cover, but if you talk to processors, they're delivering the opposite message to the growers because they want the cleanest possible product coming into their facilities, because it really slows them down when they got a lot of grass thatch or twigs or other debris in the nuts. And so that's kind of what we're fighting with here. But the amount of bare ground that we have in the industry is catching a lot of eyes, and it's so I think we're going to have some changes probably in the future in terms of how we're maintaining our alleys, our orchard alleys.
So would it make sense then to do above ground for the first couple of years right next to the trunk, like where the roots are?
Yes.
And then 3 or 4 years later, put your sub drip in after?
Yeah, that works.
Okay.
But there has to be optimal timing because you're going to use a shank to get that line. Yeah, a little root pruning. So there's an optimal timing for that.
You don't want to disturb the roots too much, I guess what you're saying.
Yeah, exactly.
So what we do, okay, basically, when the tree is planted,
We come within that distance right there of the tree.
Okay.
okay, and then we over irrigate it. So that's why you got pretty good growth on these trees, and that's the reason. So we were
push 6 feet wide.
yeah. So we basically did some experiments and figured out how far we had
How
to
far
push.
the wedded area would
yeah,
be from
exactly.
the- yeah.
So
Okay.
all the young trees got good moisture.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So when you run your irrigation, how long are you running it for? Like 24 hours, 36 hours?
No, I think it was it 6 hours every third day or something. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that was enough to keep the the
Yeah.
broad. Okay.
The trees really like water.
Yeah.
So even if you can only a lot of growers I work with they don't have water rights. So you can get your nephew or something on a truck with a big tank and just giving them a shot of water a couple times a season makes a big difference. We've seen that in our trials. We've got one treatment where we just water once or twice per season, and you get a lot more growth that way.
Do you want to just look go to the suckers or yeah?
Yeah.